Today, we're talking framing terms. If you're new to the building industry or outside of it, then a lot of these terms might seem like complete gibberish to you. So what I'm gonna do today is go over some of the most commonly used terms so that if you're a new builder, an architect, a designer, a homeowner, or just anyone that wants to be part of the conversation, you will be better informed. Okay, first, let's start with the most basic and most common used terms. 2x4 and 2x6. And this is primarily what you're gonna see being used as studs in new construction. In the old school, they only use 2x4 really for exterior walls. Now, why do we call it a 2x4? Because you measure the width 2 inches by the length 4 inches. Back in the old school, it was a true 2 inch by 4 inch. Now we've skimped and we've shrunk it down to 1.5 inches by 3.5, but we still call it a 2x4. Now, in new construction, most applications are gonna use a 2x6 for exterior walls. They're deeper, they can fit more plumbing and more insulation. But if you hear people talking about 2x, that just means a 2-inch thick piece of wood by any length. You can go all the way up to 2x24 and above. But just know, when you're talking about 2x, you're talking about a thicker piece of framing. Stud, the most common term in construction. A stud is a 2x that makes up a wall assembly. Now, studs, they come in pre-cut lengths depending on what your ceiling is. Primarily 8, 10, and 12 feet, but of course, you can cut them to any length that you need. You can even pre-order them in different lengths. But let's talk about how studs relate to door openings, wall assemblies, things like that. So anytime you have a group of 2 or more studs, we call that a stud pack. So the king stud is going to be the longest stud that goes from the bottom plate, this bottom piece, all the way to the top plate continuously. That's a king stud. Now, so here we have 2 king studs in the middle with a trimmer stud on each side, because this trimmer goes from the bottom plate to underneath this header. It doesn't go all the way to the top plate. Okay, now at the top here, above the top plate in our header, we have our cripple studs. Cripple studs are just cut at random lengths as necessary to continue the wall all the way to the ceiling, to the roof, wherever you need it to finish. Okay, so you heard me say bottom plate. What is that? The bottom plate is the stud that is sat long ways on the ground in which you attach your stud to. We call it the bottom plate because it's at the bottom. Now, instead of coming in pre-cut lengths to ceiling size, you order your bottom plates in 16-foot lengths because they're going around the whole entire perimeter of your structure. Now, we're on a second story right now, so this is not sitting on the slab. But if this was sitting on the slab, it would be called a sill plate, and you want to get treated lumber for that. It's pressure treated, it's going to hold up much better to potential moisture contact because you're much closer down to the ground. Okay, now we know what bottom plates are. Your top plate is always going to be a double top plate. So there's a bottom plate, a double top plate, and the studs go in between. The top plate can also commonly just be known as your ceiling height. If you have an 8 feet ceiling, your top plate is going to be right above 8 feet. The other thing the top plate does is it allows the roof framing to sit on top of the wall. You heard me say headers. A header is simply a piece of lumber that spans the opening of a door or window frame. So what this header does, in this case, our engineer spec'd out a double 2x12 header. So there's 2 of these right here. What this header does is it carries the load of this opening. The wider you get, the beefier the header has to be. The more weight that's on top of it, the beefier it has to be. If you get super wide, you might need to go with a steel header instead of wood. All right, let's talk beams. A very common term that you will hear is an LVL. This is a piece of laminated veneer lumber. We talked about 2x's already. This is a standard 2x. This is cut directly from a tree. It is one solid piece of wood. With an LVL, what they do is they cut thin slices, thin veneer from the tree. They dry everything out, they glue all of these pieces, and then they press it super tight, so that what happens is the strength of an LVL is about 2 to almost 3 times as much as standard lumber. So you're gonna see LVLs in those big spans for headers, when you remove load-bearing walls, sometimes used as a joist, which is gonna hold up a second floor, things of that nature. Okay, you heard me say joist. This right here is a joist. All it is gonna be, in this case, is a 2x12 that's being used to hold a floor above it. So you can have a joist in a deck, you can have a joist in a subfloor. In this case, we have a joist right here between our first and second floor. Now, same principle, but this is a truss. So a joist is just a solid piece of lumber. You could really have an LVL joist as well, but in this case, it's just a 2x12. But these are called floor trusses. So these trusses, they're manufactured off-site. You see all these different cuts and pieces. So the truss designer will design these trusses to carry the load that we need. They come already made and you simply just install them. Now, there's also different types of trusses. Like I said, these are floor trusses because a floor goes on top of them. But there's also roof trusses. Come over here. There's actually 2 types right here. So a roof truss is exactly that. If your truss makes up your roof system, it is called a roof truss. Here, we have a flat ceiling, and even though our roof is nearly 10 feet taller, it's all still made up in that truss system. Now come over here. These are a type of roof truss that we would call scissor trusses, because they aren't flat. So you see how the shape of those trusses makes up the roof. So you can get these designed in any shape, any slope that your roof is made of. So why roof trusses are great is, you see in this 14-foot lofted ceiling, we have a roof truss that spans the distance from there all the way over to the opposite side of the room with a full height lofted ceiling. Okay, now you know what trusses are, but let's talk about how they're installed and how we repair them if necessary. If you hear the term hangers, this is a hanger. All the hanger is a cradle that actually holds the truss in it, and it bolts onto our header up here. Okay, so the hanger holds the truss. Now, this is a renovation. So all the trusses in this area above us were here already. But when we took out load-bearing walls, they have to be at different spans. So we cut the truss, and then what our engineer wants us to do to repair them is put plywood on either side of the truss, and he recommended 2 feet back from the cut. The thing is, since the trusses are manufactured, they cannot be altered without a repair and a letter from an engineer saying you did it in the correct way. Let's talk subfloor, exactly what I'm standing on. So the subfloor is going to go on top of the joist. If this subfloor wasn't here, there'd be spaces between all of our joists or the trusses like we saw below. So the subfloor, what we use primarily is 1.1/8 thick. This is Advantech, and what we do is we get an adhesive and we glue down the subfloor on top of our joists or our trusses. Okay, now, above us might seem like a joist, and they look like a joist, and they kind of serve the same purpose. But when you're up against a roof, so when the roof is directly over it, those are called rafters. And these rafters, they can make up ceilings when you loft them. They can make up the soffit, which is the eaves, and then the overhang, which is on the outside. We call those the rafter tails. Sheathing, another very commonly used term, is simply the plywood skin on the outside of the house. There's 2 primary applications. This is zip sheathing, which is our plywood with a water vapor barrier on top. The other application is OSB, which is that particle board that you see on the inside of this sheathing, wrapped in Tyvek, which is a water vapor barrier. They both do the same things, it's just all about preference. Now, we use this same sheathing on our roof deck, but when you put it on a roof deck, we don't call it sheathing, we call it decking. Knowing these terms is not the end-all be-all. I know it's overwhelming. There are tons of terms to learn. You don't want to sound stupid, but just like anything, The more you're exposed to it, the more you'll learn. The more you see what these actual things are, the more they will make sense in your head. But ultimately, if you want to walk the walk, you got to talk the talk. So I'll be releasing a series of videos covering terms on the broad spectrum of construction. Stay tuned. I'll see you on the next one.